I lost my mother when I was very young. My only memory of her is telling me bedtime fairy tales about a mysterious village. The village of Doolin, where the living could meet the dead.
You know, if there is a game that you can say is the best game no one's ever played, I think this is it. Released in 2007, this PlayStation 3 exclusive was published by Sony and developed by the good people at Game Republic. This is Ellen and Keats. These two have just been asked to go to the town of Doolin.
And now she tells me she's alive. Mother, why did you wait so long?
Editorial Department, Unknown Realm magazine.
Help! Help me! These fairies,
What? Speak up, please.
they'll kill me! The village, Doolin, on the cliff of sea. Help me!
It doesn't work out as they'd hoped though. As it happens, the first thing they see as soon as they get into town is a dead body.
A murder in the village of the dead. Tell me this is a joke.
It's not all bad news though. As luck would have it, that very same night, the dead offer them the power to enter the realms of the afterlife, what they affectionately refer to as the Netherworld. There, they can talk to the dead, and they can ask them all about the murders that are plaguing this, well, otherwise charming seaside village. The game is divided into chapters, and the chapters are divided into night and day. At the start of the chapter, you can select one of the two characters and view the story from their perspective, then move on to the other character, or you can stick with the one and play as long as you can before the other one has to catch up. During the day, the story plays out as a murder mystery. You get to walk around town, ask people questions, gather evidence, and generally you try to figure out who the killer is. Also, while you're talking to the people, you're going to want to collect mementos from the dead, which are going to help you find them in the afterlife. With that being said, nighttime's where all the fun happens. The mementos open passages to the realms of the Netherworld, where you'll be able to go look for the soul of the person it belonged to. Bear in mind though, as you're walking around the Netherworld and enjoying the view, you are going to run into these creatures called the Folk. They are a collection of human souls that have gathered and taken form. Don't let that fool you though, I don't think they like you very much. And just to keep things from getting boring, those souls you're looking for are being guarded by enormous folk called the Folklore. And before you ask, no, I don't think they like you either. The Netherworld also has its own separate story, independent from the one happening in the land of the living. There, things are more political intrigue than murder mystery. But either way, they're both gonna need your help solving their problems. When you're in town, the game sort of feels like an old adventure game. Since the town is not very big, you should be able to find your way around fast. There are a couple of things you can do here and there, but for the most part you're going to be walking around, talking to people and collecting mementos. On the bright side of things though, when you come back from the land of the dead, you're going to be bringing back messages for the living. You know, just to help them get some closure. On the other hand, when you're in the Netherworld, the game plays out as an action RPG. When you're fighting the folk, what you have to do is beat on them until their very essence pops out of their bodies. Their id. Once you've done that, you jank it out of their bodies and absorb it. By doing this, they become part of your arsenal and you can assign them to any face button you want. For the most part, these little trained minions are universal to both characters. However, for the sake of keeping things interesting, some of them do have different functions or moves. The game is also nearly identical for both characters, except for one or two minor details. The only other thing worth mentioning is that you can find cloaks for Ellen to wear, while Keats gets a temporary power boost, which makes him invincible and powers up his attacks. Visually, this is still a very pretty game. Doolin itself may be small, but there is a lot of attention to detail here. It's really the little things. The realms of the Netherworld are also really fun to look at. They're all very diverse and interesting, but on top of that they're also fairly unique. Same goes for the folk. There's a lot of diversity among these things. Big, short, weird, and everything in between. But generally they're all pretty fascinating. As for the regular humans, they're actually all very well designed too. Very grounded. which is a little weird for an RPG. Bottom line, the game has aged really well. And the only other thing worth mentioning is that there are some frame rate issues when there are too many enemies on screen, but that's rare. In terms of music, the soundtrack is solid. It really helps the game establish a personality of its own. Just to let you know though, there is one piece you'll be listening to over and over again, and that is the piano melody that plays when you're in Doolin. Fortunately, it's not a bad piece. It's solemn, a little haunting, which is great because if you're stuck listening to the same thing over and over again, it does help if it doesn't suck. Okay, so there is one thing I didn't mention about absorbing your enemy's essence, and that is that when you're holding on to them, the way you yank it out and absorb it is by making an up motion with the controller. You see, the way it worked out was, back in the day when the PlayStation 3 was still new, Sony made a big push for every exclusive that it had to have some kind of use for the 6-axis controller. The problem was, most of the time developers would only have one or two functions for it, and it always felt like an afterthought more than an actual mechanic. However, Folklore was not one of those games. Yeah, I know, at first it sounds like it's just a gimmick, but the use of the 6-axis controller really is part of the core of the gameplay. Not only that, but this game has some of the most varied and creative uses for the motion controller I've ever seen. It's very responsive and it really showcased how well the thing works. But more important than that, it's actually a lot of fun. Alright, so the graphics are great, the art style is unique and interesting, the music's fantastic, and the gameplay is solid. The story itself, it's okay. It won't be winning any awards anytime soon, and you gotta be pretty dull-witted not to figure it all out before the end of the game. It's not bad though, it serves the game well enough and it's interesting in its own right. The characters themselves are also good, a little flat, but solid enough. Lastly, the game has a dungeon builder, where you can create a maze of your own or play other people's off the network. Now, as much as I'm gushing over this game, it's not without its flaws, big or small. You know, it's great that you have access to dozens and dozens of creatures on the fly, but there is a small loading time after you assign one or more to the face buttons. Now, to be fair, it's not that long, but when you're in the middle of a fight, it can really feel the part. Also, the dodge can be a little frustrating. It tends to be rigid and clunky. That's not something I can really show though, that's something you have to feel with the controller in your hands. But it's not useless. It's just going to take some practice before you can actually use it in combat. I also wish there was more voice acting in this game. Now the voice acting itself was okay, that's not the problem. The problem is that there are spots in the game where you might go for a long period of time without actually hearing anybody talk.
Who are you?
By the way, there is no trophy support for this game. I know that's important to a lot of you, so just keep it in mind. In all fairness though, these are pretty small complaints. Certainly nothing you'd say ruins the experience. However, the game does have one major flaw. That being that the game can get very repetitive. Standard RPG setup here. You fight some baddies, you level up. You level up, you fight some tougher baddies. By the way, the folk can also level up, but rather than combat experience, they all have a list of requirements. You can also do quests for the living and the miscellaneous. Doing quests and leveling up your folk means that you have to go back to areas you've already visited. Now bear with me. Let's say you travel to a world to fill the requirements of a group of folk that can only be completed there. Then you leave and do the same for another bunch at a different world. Well, sometimes you're going to find that the requirements you've just unlocked need you to go back to the world you just came from. And traveling between worlds is not a very simple process. And as gorgeous as these realms may be, after a while it can start feeling a little heavy. That's not too bad though. It's pretty common in RPGs, and honestly if that's where it ended, I wouldn't even bother bringing it up. The problem is that you have to do it all twice. It also doesn't help that all the stages are identical for both characters. It doesn't take very long before your second playthrough becomes more tedious than fun. This isn't something that's going to keep you from enjoying the game, but it might keep you from finishing it. If you don't mind some advice though, if you really want to do all the little extras in the game, then I'd suggest picking a character, sticking with them as far as they go, and then taking a short break from the game. This way, you can do all the things the game has to offer without getting burned out on the second character's playthrough. Despite all of that though, the game is still very much worth playing. Yeah, it's got its issues, but the good easily outweigh the bad. The game is fun, it's gorgeous, and above all, well, at least for me, it's imaginative. Yeah, and just to top it all off, this game is easy to find for under $20. Which is great, because it would have been a little harder for me to recommend this title at full retail due to all of its shortcomings. But coming in at under 20, this game is definitely a must. If you still don't know if this is your cup of tea, there are 2 demos available on the PlayStation Store, for whatever reason, so why not give it a chance?